Fjördianism, an intellectual discussion in philosophy and theology. Written by Auden Debussy Fjörds. Presented by Samantha Studios. Chapter title: God. Paragraph 1. The objection which I face here at the end of the Fjördian texts is placed as such because of its brevity. The existence of God is apparent to man, perhaps the most obvious aspect of what he understands. I here shall succeed in explaining, proving, and moving one to not only understand but to accept, and begin to fathom who and what God is, if the remainder of the text has not already done so. Paragraph 2. There lies an intrinsic necessity for God in everything which is. In order for something to be, it must have been brought into being by a form of energy. However, energy cannot be created nor destroyed. This leaves a necessity for something outside of our physical constraints of space and time to enact energy, by way of the first movement. This being, we understand, is the first mover. This mover is everything, as every aspect of the dimension flows within this being. It is all that is. Though the mover is distinct from that which the being has enacted, matter in time, not being God, this entity is truly one with existence itself, for its will is that in which all things take being. It is reality, that which is, and all who make this entity's natural institute in union with their own consciousness become truly real. The first mover cannot be in contradiction with himself, as that which is may not be that which is not. Thus, there is only one of these entities. Anything which has a similar power, if it may be, must be only lesser, for any such duality of the being is stuck in the crux of the paradox. If there be two such gods, they must be of the same being in every quality and respect, making them in actuality one God. However, if they are to be differing, then the one which differs is impossible, as that which is cannot be that which is not. The subject of the persons of God are a different matter entirely. That which is has a perfect understanding of itself, and what God, who is reality, understands will become, and is manifested in its fullness. This is, using the appropriate form of the human family, the Son. And since the Son and Father share a perfect understanding, and thus an intimate appreciation and love of each other, the Spirit proceeds from them, much in the same way that I look in the mirror, understand myself, who is I as well, and appreciate and love myself from myself. And yet only God realizes this perfectly. It is the I, you, and it in which the human mind has come to know over time. 4. God, being that which is, holds all things within him, yet distinct from him. All things, because they exist within reality and the natural order, may not deviate from the reality and the natural order on their own accord, unless a creature who is permitted with the intent that it will turn towards good and reject deviance, a free will, chooses to do so. As the universe is in a fallen state, there is a necessity that in the fourth dimension a creature with the free will chose against the natural order and reality. No allowance like this is made in order for evil to happen, as this contradicts reality. The allowance is that a greater turning of wills may overturn this one fallen choice, resulting in an outweighing of good to evil, with God's splendor increased, if one may say such a thing. 5. How is it that God is an intelligence and not simply a mover? The divine intelligence shall be defined with a slight distinction to its application in our realm. This distinction being that God has no need to require knowledge, for he is the very act of knowing. Thus, the entity's intelligence must fulfill a new criteria for us to call it so. 1. It must apply its knowledge and skill, not remain idle with its power. 2. It must be able to suspend the natural order, not alter it or deviate it, a paradox, but suspend it to the manifestation of its reality-defining power, which exists out of time and space. And 3. It must show the ability of choice, a defining factor of will. Let us not grow rash. These criteria are not for the architect's necessity, but for ours, as a manifestation of the divine in the fourth dimension would be quite helpful. The concept of the intelligence, or the will, is the pivot point between the atheist and the deist, perhaps the most important distinction, nay, difference, in the whole of this text. The following scenarios make proof for the intelligence. Firstly, there lies the fact of that odd exception, that peculiar aspect of free will. How can we conclude that man's will is any different than that of the animals, foregoing the soul? The answer lies in man's relationship with nature. The remainder of the natural material world lives on in peaceful equilibrium. Though one may paint it with fierceness and mercilessness, it is the fierceness of rigidity. It is the mercilessness of necessity. Its natural evils, if we may even call them so, are always done in order that another good may supplant what is lacking. A fire consumes a forest, a better forest arises. This beautiful equipoise continues on without deviance, with the exception of outside forces, of course. Man, however, is not like this. Man consistently finds ways to pervert the order, to bend the right ways, to obfuscate the obvious, and to deform what once had form. This is the oddity of man. If we are but creatures, we should surely have found our place in the equilibrium of material nature. Material nature can be assumed in the cycles in which it takes place. We may make every prediction of it. It continues to follow a circular nature of its own path. Why does man not follow this nature? Why are we bucking here? Why have we not found our place in the equilibrium? It is not the case to be found. What then separates us so starkly, so oddly from material nature? We must conclude here that man's will must be of some different genre, if it does not work by instinct alone. And so from our perversity, working backwards, we find free will, the ability for man to choose between the good, the natural, and the evil, the unnatural. But really, we should find this rather odd. One creature out of the millions that is able to deviate. There is no other such specimen. No other creature is able to deviate in such a way. This, in the truest sense, is unique. Why were all things not implanted with free will, and why not nothing? And here we find an example of that entity who may decide on a particular, not against logic whatsoever, yet curiously with preference for one point over another. This is one sign of the intelligence. And even if the other creatures are found with such an ability of free will, let us never forget that not all things may deviate, for all that is may not be all that is not, simultaneously. It is an impossibility. There exists a preference, and there exists an intelligence. 7. The aspects of preference have no end. The fact that there is, as opposed to that there is not, is one of such things. The very preference for reality versus an unreality is very prominent, especially in the upper dimensions, where knowing alternate realities, truly unrealities, is a gift of the higher creatures. Our placement in the dimensional realm is yet another example of preference. What divine motivation could have spurned our residence in the fourth dimension? One cannot hear but the melody and lyrics. How strange it is to be anything at all. The ineffable architect's choices we will never be able to completely comprehend. The context is beyond us, the motives unreachable. But we may, however, conclude that since he enacts the reality, and thus natural, that these preferences are by definition perfect. And so, if one comes this far, and still does not conclude that there is a God, but rather that there could be a God, we run into another paradox. For anything which could be, which is possible, must have, by definition, something which is able to enact it. For an example, a cake may exist. However, by definition, it must have had something to bring it into existence. A baker, for example. However, with the concept of God, even if we do not believe he exists, and yet believe he might exist, the agnostic. We understand that what could bring God into existence except for himself? We've come to understand that God, being the necessity, the uncreated necessity, there may be nothing to bring him into existence except for himself. We find this odd. How could something unexisting bring itself into existence without any pre-existing motives or effects? This is true. That would be impossible. However, if God may exist, and by definition that means that there is something which must bring it into existence, and the only thing which would be able to bring it into existence would be God itself, we find that God, being omnipresent, not limited by space or time, must exist in order to continue on his own existence. And we find that he lives for his own existence by its very definition. And so, the agnostic, I tell you, if you believe that the God might be possible, but you do not know if the God is indeed existing, know that by the definition, if he is possible, the God must exist. So in order for him to exist, something of his ilk must be able to bring him into existence, and yet there cannot be a multiplicity, and thus God exists if he may exist. This has concluded the chapter on God by Auden Debussy Fjörds.